My name is Luca Russo. I am presenting on Herbarium Specimens show patterns of native and invasive wild fruit ripening across New England from the 1800s to the present, which is a long-winded title, and I'm sorry. My advisor is Dr. Richard Premack from the biology department. And so in our lab, we study phenology. Phenology is the timing of seasonal events. So when do things like hibernation or migration happen? Or when do trees lose their leaves in the fall? Or when do they produce their flowers in the spring? Currently, phenology has sort of an underlying issue that a lot of the research has been focused around spring research. We know a lot about what's going on with plants specifically in the spring. When do they produce new leaves and when do they produce flowers? And we also know what's going on in changing temperatures and a changing climate. But we don't really know much about fruiting. So we decided that I wanted to look at fruiting as a process and see what changes were going on with fruiting over time. And this is not much is known about fruiting, sadly. So if I asked you guys what picture is on the screen right now, you guys would say?
Blueberry.
Wonderful. And then if I asked you, what's that other thing? Yes. In reality, so the left one is high bush blueberry. You guys were right. And the one on the right is a rose fruit. A lot of people don't know that roses produce fruit. Yeah. And I kind of just highlighted there that both in the general public as well as in the scientific field, a lot really isn't known about these. And another major problem is what's above the pictures, so native versus invasive species statuses. So in New England, we have these competing functional groups, I guess you could say. So native groups, or native species that are species that have been in New England, have grown here, and then invasive species that have come here from other places and are very good at colonizing, very good at taking over the landscape and changing native or eliminating native species and excluding them by having just overall better qualities, I guess. And so we also know that in the autumn, birds are migrating later, but we don't know what fruits are doing. But we do know that if birds are staying later, they have to be eating something. And so we wanted to look at if fruits are changing with climate so that they can also produce fruits into the time when birds would be here. And so what I wanted to get is an idea of what was going on with this type of plant from now until the 1800s, the scope of my project. But of course, that isn't something that people readily collected. We find that for spring events like flowers that people really like, they collect a lot of data on it, and we have a lot of data available to us back even to Thoreau. But after Thoreau wonderfully kept some observations about fruiting, a lot of people didn't. And so there's a large paucity of data. There's a very big scarcity of data on fruiting events. And so to try and combat this, we found that we could use herbarium specimens or plant museum specimens to tell us more about fruiting as a process and how it's been affected over the past 200 years by sort of saying, so these are all specimens that have been collected anytime between now and I guess the late 1800s. And so you can sort of see that this is like a pressed plant. They kind of just took a whole branch and pressed it. You can see right here that there are ripe fruits on here. You can see that they were red, juicy. They almost look like prunes now. And you can see that there on this tag is a lot of information in terms of locality, the place that it was, and the time that it was collected, as well as who collected it. And so what we wanted to do was find these ripe specimens, record all that information, and then compare it to temperature data as well as to geography data and see what's going on with fruiting and see if we can understand some patterns with it. To give you, ooh, that's weird. Okay, well, sorry that these pictures aren't showing up right now, but this should highlight, this is supposed to show you a swatch of the season to understand what these ripe fruits would be looking for, but you can sort of see them here. That on July 2nd, this is what a typical fruit would look like for this species, Berberis thunbergii, or Japanese barberry. That here they're just kind of very small, very hard, not really looking very good. On August 6th, they look a little bit better, a little bit more swelled, but still not great, still very hard. And then on October 17th, very red, color changes happened. They looked like they were juicy. And you can kind of even see here that a little bit of a bite was taken out of one. And these are the ones that we would classify as mature, the ones that we would copy down, the ones that we would say, yes, this is a ripe specimen. And so in terms of results, we found that when we compared it to local temperature, there wasn't a major trend. There was none with regional temperature, and none with geography, and none with any over time even. And when I say no trends, I mean that there were statistical trends. They were statistically significant. However, they explained a very small variation, so they were not biologically significant. And so this is just you can sort of see that there is a trend line here, but there's a gigantic cloud of data, and it doesn't really fit anything at all, which is okay, I guess. And so the thing that we did find that was super interesting, however, was that species did differ in their fruiting times. And so you can sort of see here, I have on the y-axis when they were fruiting in terms of the date. You have a lot of species that sort of fruit at the beginning of the season, like July, August, and then a lot of species that also fruit at the other extreme into November, December. And what you will notice is that the red points are a lot more concentrated in the end of the season, whereas the blue-green points are more concentrated towards the beginning. The blue-green points are native species, and so they fruit on average about 33 days earlier than invasive species, or the red points. And the blue species, the native species, have a smaller standard deviation and have a smaller variation in the times that they can produce these fruits. And so why is this important? So like we sort of mentioned earlier, that birds are migrating later. And so if they're migrating later, they have a potential to be eating only invasive fruits. If they're staying later, well past the native time, or the native species' time to fruit, the native species won't be able to produce fruits later into the year because they have a smaller variation. Whereas the invasive species that are now here can now produce fruits into the time that the migratory birds are staying, and as well as have a larger variation and take advantage of times before that where they can also feed organisms. And so yeah, that's sort of my talk. I just want to give some acknowledgments. I want to say thank you to my wonderful advisor, Dr. Richard Premack, a PhD candidate in our lab, Amanda Gallinet, for all the work that she's done with me, helping me out, as well as Eli Malayas of the Earth and Environment, who helped me get all these temperature records, even though they ended up not being super significant, but still great to have, and the Kilachand Honors College for helping to support me throughout this. And questions? Sure.
So when the birds ingest the fruits, they excrete the seeds.
Yes.
Going farther south, they're spreading the invasive species?
Yes, so that is the real important takeaway. I'm sorry for not mentioning it. That as birds start to eat more and more invasive plants, they start to also disperse more invasive fruits, or invasive seeds. And so this could also play back into this idea that invasive species are good at propagating, and that could be playing a large role in changing the landscape. Courtney?
How many species did you sample total?
So we sampled 59 species and then had to eliminate, I think it was broken down to about 38 native species and 21 invasive species. We looked at what were the most common ones here. We ended up having to eliminate about 4 of them because we just didn't have a strong enough sample size. Ben?
Did you compare the invasive species to when they fruit in their native ranges, or is that something that was not?
That wasn't something that we did, particularly because it isn't necessarily something that's important, but a lot of them are also from places that they might be fruiting year-round, so it might not also be relevant. Yes?
So I'm curious about whether you subdivided the plants that fruited into plants where the birds would eat them in the fall and the ones in the spring. And so the last picture you have is of a robin.
Yes.
And that looks like a spring tree. So those fruits probably overwintered. So there, you would imagine that there might be a different selection pressure on the different types of fruits.
Sure. So I would say you're right that there are different selection pressures. However, American robins are also something that stay here year-round now, or there are certain populations that stay here year-round, so that might not be something similar. Yeah.